Thank you very much. Our Deputy Dean, Ajan, as a director of the Center for European Studies, the Council of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University, I would like to welcome all participants to the seminar lessons from hybrid warfare and real combats, what public can learn from Russian and Ukrainian war. As I mentioned before, these are 4 events that have been arranged since the war outbreak by our center in February 2022. Now it's been over 17 months already. However, this event is so special to me because it is the first time that we have the Ukrainian flying himself in person, right? And I believe that it is the first event that we have the real one, not online, not hybrid, to sit with us today. And because of this, I refrain myself not to be the speaker because I don't think that I'm qualified enough. So I need to bring Professor Tilipat and say that you need to be another speaker to match her. Because, so please give the first round to all speakers. First round of applause. And for the first speaker, Professor Tilipat received his MA from Oxford University and his PhD from University of Wales at Cambridge, and he is Deputy Dean as well at Thomson Faculty of Political Science and directing BA and MA in International Relations English program. He is all-rounded. He's keen on IR theory, security studies, any area studies. He involved a lot in Russian and Eastern European countries area, so that he could contribute a lot. And then coming to Dr. Hanna Shelest, she received her MA from Odessa National University and PhD from Ukrainian Academy of Science. She is currently directing Ukrainian Prism that Ajan just introduced to you. This is like a foreign policy council, the president of it, if I'm not wrong. So she advised numerous security committees and working groups, such as the Navy strategy, foreign policy strategy, NATO strategy, and also strategy of Ukraine towards Asia as well. So, before we start, I would like to draw your attention on the situation of Russian and Ukrainian war first, maybe, and then if I will contribute to that. Whether over 17 months now, is there any developments that we unprecedentedly never seen before, or this is going to reach 24 months, and we don't want to meet again in that pause anyway, we always talk about that. And the pattern, the continuity, any changes, and maybe some contribution on hybrid warfare. Yes, Professor Tilipat, the floor is yours.
And I will try to look at this to discuss and analyze the Russo-Ukrainian war. So symbolically, the Russian war is a widespread characterization in the discourse of international relations. It is often noted that don't hold the Russian war, especially the angry and aggressive one. In his article, The Russian War Returns, Nick Danforth, for example, claimed that, since last year's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian war has returned to the map. Round of Polar by turns is once again sharpening his claws, opening his doors, and crawling across the pages of our papers. Similarly, the New York Times asserted that, driven by the anger at Russia and the need to be reasonable at home and abroad, Ukraine is similarly avoiding its much more powerful antagonists. By using this metaphorical symbol, we can divide ways in which the scholars explain the causes of Russia's war against Ukraine on 24th February 2022 into two groups. The first, what I call the Poking the Russian Bag explanation, most notably is John Mishine, an IR theorist of offensive mechanisms. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So that's one take, right? So he and some other scholars highlight internet innovation as a strategic move in response to these advantages in power shift. The second explanation, I think, is the Russian bag poking the West or poking the world explanation. Liberals, especially Michael Macro, asserted that Western support for Ukrainian democracy was the main cause of Putin's war against Ukraine. Likewise, other scholars like Richard Devault argues that Ukraine and the West mainly had defensive intentions. As Devault concludes, Putin exaggerated the extent to which any of his posed strategic threat to Russia and unnecessarily triggers a costly and dangerous arms spiral between Russia and the West. Treating Putin as a rational or calculating leader is wrong because the principal motive for his war is our spirit, and invading Ukraine is a means to his end and of asserting Russian power. Both claims do not pay much attention to what I call the discursive underpinnings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I think the war is part of what I call discursive balancing that Russia has used to manage the psychological and emotional dissatisfaction with the West. At the same time, it is also emotional diplomacy, especially official diplomacy of anger. So the first part, I'm trying the first part to map the discursive strategies of war justification. In the second part, I'd like to argue that rather than a departure from hybrid warfare paradigm, Russia war is a continuation of hybrid war by other means, to paraphrase Clausewitz. So through the discursive analysis, I think the war is part of the changing character of warfare since the end of the Cold War, so-called hybrid or regular warfare paradigm. Last but not least, I'd like to explore how the war is performatively practiced on the ground. I have some observations on the practices of war to the issues of the relationship. First, the relationship between military technology and warfare. The second one about the morale of nations, and the third one about the moralization of warfare. So 3 things. So let's start with the first part about the discourse of war or discourses at war. Next slide, please. Right. So, sorry, last slide. Thank you. We now know that the Russo-Ukrainian war is involved in a real and tragic consequences. It horrifically affects lives and property of the Ukrainian people. War is not legitimate, but war needs to be justified. Some wars are justifiable, like self-defense and UNSC authorized military or peace operations. Some wars are not. And I think Russia's war in Ukraine is an example. Many usually talk about the causes, conduct, and consequences of war, specifically conduct of war. It's widely reported in the media where stories of many ordinary people are told. For me, what we need to see is the construction of narratives of these causes, or what I call discursive balancing. As one scholar, strategist scholar, Warren Friedman, puts it, and I quote, Putin launched a war based on a narrative constructed out of potential symbols, deep-seated grievances, historical myths, and claims about Ukraine that were falsified as soon as they were tested. Most of all, it was self-deception, for he was the one responsible for the narrative, most convinced by its potency and ready and able to act on it. I want to argue further that the war is part of long-term process of discursive balancing that Russia has used to manage the so-called emotional dissatisfaction with the Discursive balancing is a form of balancing at the level of discourse. First of all, Russians use the narrative of victim mood. Since 2014 Ukrainian crisis, Russian-speaking people in Donbass were framed as victims of violence spearheaded by so-called neo-Nazi regime, Kiev, and so on and so forth, as in need of Russian protection. So he claimed that Putin claimed that residents of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions have again made their choice to be with their fatherland in local elections earlier this last month. Second, Ukraine is seen from Russian narrative as a symbol of Western aggressions against Russia. Ukraine is often framed in Russian media as an anti-Russian springboard. I think in his July 2021 article titled on the historical unity of Russian and Ukrainians, Putin has repeatedly stated that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. He even claimed that Ukraine is part of Russia. So from this point of view, I think this is the narrative that Russia has that construct a kind of myth of Russian discourses. And the myths go on because Ukraine is a Russian land. It has no right to decide its own future and should be returned to the Russian world. After the invasion, Russia has discursively shifted the blame for the conflict onto the West. It depicts the Western military assistance sent to Ukraine as a direct cause for the prolongation of violence in the war. This shift in narrative is part of discursive balancing, and it is also covered with emotional diplomacy, especially official emotion of anger. Russian state, through its leaders, have expressed an emotion of anger, especially moral outrage against the West and its hostile ideology, mostly, namely liberalisms. These discourses and emotional diplomacy were instrumental to the justification of the 2022 special military operation. Under the Russian moral justification for Nazism, genocide, and the threat of the West and the broken promises of NATO enlargement are repeatedly emphasized. Even he talked about, Putin talked about, Russia engaging in the so-called Holy War, and I think Putin's anger has been its crucial determinant in making this war. So, according to one scholar, Putin was consumed by anger at the collapse of the Soviet Union and its empire. Putin feels like by the West, sees with anger and seeks revenge. Invading Ukraine is a means to this end and of asserting Russian power. Next slide, please. So how can we understand about this war? Okay, the war is often seen as a hybrid war gone wrong, which is true, and a departure from hybrid war paradigm, which I think is not true or not accurate. Through the discursive analysis, the war is part of a broader changing character of war since the end of the Cold War, the hybrid war paradigm. LSE professor Mary Cowdoy used to conceptualize this paradigm, the new war thesis, which has some characteristics such as the intrastate warfare, globalization of violence, privatization of violence, use of force through arms groups, synergies, or private military companies. I think the new war paradigm includes asymmetrical regular warfare paradigm. In the post-Cold War era, the war is not declining, but it is transformed. We see a fundamental shift in war paradigm. Though proclaiming that it was a special military operation, Russian invasion of Ukraine, packed with tank convoys, pushing front lines inward, was reminiscence of old conventional warfare at the periphery of Europe. One scholar put it, in February 2022, Russia launched a new stage in the war against Ukraine. A full-scale invasion replaced the hybrid war that Russia supported with its years and has been fighting in eastern Ukraine since 2014. On the contrary, I would like to argue that Russia's war on Ukraine is a continuation of hybrid war by other means. Even the threat to use nuclear weapons is on the table. Hybrid warfare is the name for war in Ukraine. The war itself can be seen as the latest version of hybrid warfare, gearing more towards conventional warfare, though still having a regular warfare in the background. So fundamentally, this war is blurring the boundaries between military and civilian domains and the dividing line between kinetic and non-kinetic means. I think the recent clip showing Russian President Putin meeting with Andrei Toyev, former Wagner auxiliary group chief of staff, released by the Kremlin, illustrated that the war is a continuation of hybrid war by other means. In this clip, according to Putin, Russia continued to rely on mercenaries and volunteer units from private armies in the war against Ukraine, even after the Wagner uprising in June. Wagner was tasked by the Russian president with setting up new volunteer fighting units. Putin says he told Andrei Toyev that his task is to deal with forming volunteer units that could perform various combat tasks, primarily in the zone of the special military operations. Let me step back a little bit and see what the hybrid war paradigm is. I think Professor Nathan has mentioned this already. And then since it was coined by Frank Hoffman in 2007, the concept means different things to different people. I think NATO previously preferred to use the term hybrid threat, while the Russian one might use this under the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which focuses on the combination of military and non-military methods. But basically, hybrid warfare is the combination of kinetic / military and non-military means used to achieve political ends. In designated multi-dimensional warfare, which non-military subversion tactics are employed to complement military action rather than replacing it. So from this definition, I think the conventional war can be seen as part of hybrid war as well. The objective of this warfare is perhaps to destabilize, demoralize, and dismantle adversaries by weakening them from within. The current war in Ukraine right now, I think, is a combination of this hybrid war happening since at least 2014 Crimean annexation and war in eastern part of Ukraine onwards. I think I'd like to highlight about some key characteristics of this hybrid war paradigm, which I think will be a kind of the 21st war paradigm nowadays. First thing first, I think the hybrid war paradigm highlights the undeclared warfare as the preferred method to fight war. That is, the war that is never announced or declared is blurring the line between war and peace, although it still has hostility of one toward the other. At the very beginning, it might create a kind of the possible deniability for the state. But at the same time, it can avoid international law prevention of warfare. Russia used the term special military operation. The second idea is about the methods of conventional and irregular warfare. That is the hybridity of means between military and non-military means, blurring the line, dividing the line between these means. And I think there's a spectrum of hybrid warfare, okay, different degrees of means for non-military to military war, ranging from disinformation and propaganda, sabotage and foreign electoral intervention, clandestine diplomacy, including covert operations, to a network of subversive organizations, movements, and individuals, political warfare, to economic tool of statecraft such as sanctions or the use of energies as cut-off that Russia did with Ukraine in the past. approaches through private military companies or machineries such as Little Greenmet in Crimea or Wagner Group previously led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. To the end of the spectrum, the conventional warfare. I think we can see the conventional warfare from the hybrid paradigm as the highest form or highest degree of hybrid warfare. So in this sense, the hybrid warfare is therefore a form of war. Therefore, Russia's war on Ukraine is a continuation of hybrid war by other means. The third characteristic is to focus on the in-between spaces, okay, namely gray zone between peace and open violence. Some call this hybrid warfare as a gray zone warfare. Now I think we need to broaden this concept, this paradigm to the multiversal spaces, okay, because the hybrid warfare has been involved in the virtual cyberspace as well. The fourth characteristic is about the political goal. War is designed for an ultimate political end. For example, the ways in which authoritarian regimes are targeting liberal democracy by use of paramilitary and non-military means. Last but not least, the normalization of violence. Hybrid warfare paradigm render violence kind of a normal or business as usual. It blurs the domestic and international dichotomy, and I think Russia is seeking to adopt the Western discourse of the humanitarian intervention with less legitimate outcomes. However, like the Western powers, Russia's discourse demonstrated the ways in which the idea of protecting victims from mass atrocity, allegedly, it slowly become a way of punishing so-called criminal legions abroad from the military forces. I think this changing discourse is crucial in justifying the use of military powers in foreign lands, contributing to expanding the lawfulness of military operations. So it's blur the line of this domestic and international war, or in particular, I think the line between domestic crime and international war. So I think this is the beauty, the point of hybrid warfare that aim to blur between domestic crime and international war. So a new war paradigm is more seen from a criminological perspective. War is more and more seen as protection, policing, and punishment. War in Ukraine is part of this shifting discourse of and on war that render war military operations. I think I have the last part. You want me to continue or? Okay, sure. Right. So the last one, I'd like to talk about the practices of war. Next slide, please. Okay. We'll come in briefing first, and then maybe go into detail later. I think the discourse of hybrid war shapes and shows the practices and conduct of war on the ground. In this part, I would like to explore how the war is performatively practiced on the ground. I have some observations on the practice of war through the issues of the relationship between military technology and warfare, morale of nations, and the moralization of warfare. Let me just only one example of the military technology and warfare first, about the use of technical drones, I think as a weapon of the weak. Recent research highlights the use and heavy reliance on commercial drones technology for tactical aids. I think during the Donbass conflict since 2014 onwards, while Moscow supplying sophisticated drones to separatists, Ukrainians improvised with commercial drones, fighting for survival and protecting themselves in the war. So to counter Moscow-supported rebels, the Ukrainian military equipped itself with cheap technological drones to close the parity gap. The Ukrainian military are, to a certain extent, familiar with the dual usage of drones, even before the war outbreak in 2022. So on the one hand, I think Russia miscalculated the relative strength of the Ukrainian forces, especially the surprise use of technical UAVs at scale. Even one Russian Telegram channel warns that, and I quote, the enemy massively uses very cheap drones that cost pennies. We are again lagging behind. Russia urgently needs to catch up with the adversary by creating its own armies of drones. Ukrainian drones recently destroyed Russian warships. Its missiles seem to have damaged the air defense system in Crimea. It is likely that Ukrainians will strike more in order to degrade Russian infrastructure and deny its naval supremacy in the Black Sea. Looking from this perspective, from the very beginning, the tactical use of drones can be seen as a weapon of defeat. However, Russians emulate Ukrainian as well by scaling up its drone production. Russia involved its military arsenals enhance dual-use commercial platforms. The recent example, I think, is that in September, Russia has begun using Iranian-made Shahed drones to attack Ukrainian cities, including in some parts of the Odessa region. So we talk about only one example of this military, the relationship between military and technologies relations. With regard to the moral, I think it is necessary to pay more attention to the Ukrainian resilience. The myth in the Russian world of Ukrainian society as lacking agency in wartime, I think it's partly due to the prevalence of the Chavarent realist worldview, and partly due to the three narratives on Ukrainian society as first divided, second weak due to the lack of engagement with organized civil society, and third, they seem to remain part of Russian sphere of influence. However, in reality, we see the Ukrainian resilience through its ability to refuse to surrender and defend itself against the much bigger neighbor. We see everyday heroisms of Ukrainians to fight for the rights to live in independent and free Ukraine. Many people volunteer for armed combats. The question might be asked, what is the source of Ukrainian resilience? I think in Western media and scholarly analysis, the Ukrainian resilience is often associated with the Zelensky factor. The recent research offers a different take. I think Zelensky matters, of course, in terms of his leadership of the state, but also Ukrainian resilience is based on, according to recent research, one, the value foundations of Ukrainian identity and values of freedom which help Ukraine's diverse society to speak with one voice in the time of crisis. Two, the decentralized nature of Ukrainian society and traditions of self-organization. And third, the vision of better future as part of the Atlantic community. On the other hand, Russia's morale is relatively lower in comparison. There was anti-war sentiments from the outset, but I think it is the conscription which rendered war unpopular at home. Recently, Russia Defense Ministry said that it would enlist about 130,000 men for compulsory military service this fall, beginning on October 1st, so yesterday. In most regions of the country, it announced that it would, for the first time, begin enlisting residents of the annexed territory as part of this twice-yearly military conscription campaign. Russia says conscripts are not deployed to what it calls its special military operation in Ukraine or to serve in the annexed territories. However, after that service, conscripts automatically becomes reservists. However, Russia has previously deployed reservists in Ukraine. The third point is about the modernization of warfare. As Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky told gathering at the Yalta European Strategy meeting in Kiev in September, he said, and I quote, "When we are talking about this war, we are always talking about morality." I think we should differentiate between the morality of war on one hand the moralization of the war. What does it mean? I think the morality of war or ethics of war, on one hand, is about the question of moral war. That is to evaluate the war from the just war tradition. It is related to the normative dimensions of warfare, ranging from the commitment to international law and norms, and the war ethics during just at bello, justice before the war, just in bello, justice in warfare, in wartime, and just post bellum for justice after the war, in the post-war peace transformation. On the other hand, I think the challenge or the problem for the world society is about the moralization of warfare. I think this is a different story. This highlights the discursive representations through binary opposition between friends and foe, good and evil. Through moralizing each other, these two sides are entraped in the discursive struggle, which renders ceasefire or negotiation quite difficult in the first place. So the moralization of war discursively construct others as essential threats. Also, it leads to the resurgence of the Western coherence, most notably NATO solidarity. In addition, the moralization of war pushes and pressures states and people to choose or take sides in this moralized warfare. It can be framed as a good versus evil struggle. In conclusion, when Russia mobilized troops in the winter of 2021 to 2022, many analysts forecasted that Russian invasion of Ukraine was unlikely. They thought that an all-out full-scale invasion was improbable because of massive force and protected fighting for Russia. The experts' prediction was based on the rational calculation of costs and benefits. I think we can say that, well, because of the irrational of the Russian dare, for one, but also I think many scholars might ignore, neglect the discursive balancing point of view. That is, the Russian leaders are shaped by their own many discourses and the discursive representations of Russia itself and enemies, in particular in the West. So this discursive balance has framed and fabricated the war, yet they could not determine the outcomes of war. My last point is that the Russo-Ukrainian war is going to be a long war of attrition. During his visit to Washington in late September, Zelensky acknowledged that Ukrainians have to be ready for the long war. On the one hand, I think Russia will fight the war against Ukraine at all costs, simply would underpin his domestic regime survival. But on the other hand, for Ukraine, it is long war if it happens. The questions are twofold. One is whether Ukraine is ready to fight, and two is whether the Western partners are strongly committed to support Ukraine at all costs in the long run. Many predict that if Donald Trump wins in 2024, he may cut back American military assistance. In Europe, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia imposed the curbs on imports of Ukrainian grain after the EU lifted a partial ban. As a roll over the curbs escalated, Poland said it would no longer supply weapons to Ukraine. To ensure that Ukraine has the staying power to wage a long war, Ukraine perhaps can no longer depend solely on the heroic improvisation and decentralization of the early part of the war, but rather the war of attrition requires a much more resilient Ukraine, which means a retaliation, literally and economically. And then this is a tragedy. War is a tragedy of international relations, not simply a tragedy of great power politics, but a tragedy of humanity. And I think all tragedies remind us one thing about our mortality. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Professor Setipan, very much because he put the Russian bear in a very in-depth analysis in the discursive analysis, and his specialty on emotional diplomacy as well. And it is interesting to hear that he said that actually hybrid war is a continuation of hybrid war by other means. When you consider 22nd of February, 24th of February 2022, in which people tend to see that there was a different Crimea annexation 2014 seems to be more hybrid. And when Putin and Kremlin decided to do the full operation in 2022, maybe less hybrid, right? So he also outlined different definitions of hybrid war, hybrid threats by NATO, and also by the Russian side, General Gerasimov, and also outlines the means and extent of use. And I think Dr. Shelest will discuss about all this. He did start with the drones, weapons of the week, right? And it's interesting that maybe gray zone and hybrid warfare may be different. And in the end, it's so different between the true morale, right, and the moralization of warfare. It's very interesting points to jot down. And before going to Dr. Shelest, I would like to maybe draw your attention that there is a scholar who said that hybrid warfare, in fact, started since the Peloponnesian War. Really bad. So it is our monolithic war between Athens and Sparta because hybrid warfare could involve like political intervention, election, how to dominate society, people thought. So it's to trace far back at the time. But hybrid warfare started becoming official in this Crimea annexation 2014 because it involved a lot of election, referendum, which misled that Russia is the first one to have participated on, right? So many definitions by different actors. I'm interested to hear from Dr. Shelest what Ukraine's definition and what kind of form are you treat this concept differently from Russia or from the West, right? And other statements about the name is that can we poke a bear or should we? I would say that sometimes we need to poke a bear to understand that it is fake. Because not always the bear that you see is a real bear in that color that you're thinking about. Sometimes it can be just, I cannot say a nice toy. Unfortunately, in our case, it's not a nice toy. But that is something that just put to the yard to make others to be afraid. And we have more and more explanations, and I will go to that why I think like this. And this story is definitely demonstrating that we are living more in the time of myths rather than in the time of the real power and mighty that's demonstrated by some countries. And because of this, it's definitely the question of, if you start from the hybrid warfare, let's go first to the terminology. Why it is hybrid? It always should be military and non-military elements. If we don't have both, it is not hybrid warfare. It is either normal, standard, classical military warfare, or it is the information warfare, energy disputes, depending on what you have on the ground, but it is just some type of the confrontation within the countries. Hybrid exactly needs to have both elements. The only question is, and here scholars are definitely are dividing their opinion. One group are thinking that exactly what you said, that we first have hybrid as the first element, when you always know that if you don't reach your goal with the hybrid methods, you involve military.
So military as a sort of backup or the second stage. And in this case, we're thinking that probably the conventional war is inevitable. However, I usually prefer to say, and it seems to me that Russian aggression against Ukraine is perfectly demonstrated, that military always exists. The question is that is it a supporting element, the auxiliary element, for you to believe that your hybrid methods should be followed, meaning that we are using it as the leverage, as the means of proving that you really should listen to what we are saying. If you do not agree, we can use it, but you definitely believe better when you're just sat in the nice New York room of the United Nations or when you're sat with the military at your quarters. But also, they are used very often simultaneously, and the current wars compared to many others are definitely demonstrating that it's just the question is what of the two means, hybrid or military, are becoming priority for the time being. But it doesn't mean that both of them are disappearing, because during the conventional war, you still have economic blockade, you still can have cyber attacks, you still can have information warfare, or better say, you are having all of that. There is no any more of those wars when we're forgetting about these means. And definitely, a hybrid war is neither new nor Russian. It was a wonderful article by the current Minister of Foreign Affairs of Moldova. At that time, he was researcher at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, Nico Popescu, a good friend of mine. He wrote the article that named Hybrid Warfare, neither new nor Russian. But it was before 2022, so he wrote it. And the article, he referred approximately to the beginning of the 19th century, explaining definitely Bismarck and all those, how it was used. But I always joke with him that we were too lazy to look further, because ancient Greeks were perfect with the hybrid warfare methods. If you look how they act, it's just, you can put the textbook on it. Yes, they didn't have internet. Internet made a lot of things easier. But in terms of principles of the hybrid warfare, and especially in terms of using information as a part of the hybrid warfare, ancient Greeks made us students of their tactics for the centuries ahead. And that's why with the hybrid warfare, sometimes we are tricked in the situation when it starts and what to include. That's probably coming with the same discourse of soft power, hard power, or threats to the soft security and hard security when one turns to another. Because I remember 20 years ago speaking about Black Sea security, I was not speaking about navy balance. Even that I'm the person with a certain background with more of this classical security, I was speaking about the challenges, yes, of cyber. I was speaking about demography. I was speaking about political stability, energy security that had been weaponized at that time. I was not thinking about the navy balance in the Black Sea region at all. And then suddenly, the situation changed. We prioritized different things and started to realize that the hard security is still actual. But at the same time, cyber suddenly, after 2014, especially turned from this soft security basket, when it was more the business of private companies or individuals to deal with cyber security. Ukraine in 2015 included cyber domain as the fifth domain of warfare. After land, sea, space, and air, in 2015, in our new military doctrine, we included cyber as the warfare domain. Now, in 2 years, NATO included it in their documents, many European countries have, because a lot of operations that have been happening in the cyber domain started to be part of the military warfare. Most of the Russian hackers group has the direct affiliation with the either Ministry of Defense or the intelligence services of FSB. There are three main groups and they're competing with each other. That's also very funny to follow sometimes. But the operations they are doing, and also when we're saying that most of our new sophisticated military equipment, they already depended on the cyber. They already depended on the digital. So you cannot even, if you would like to forget about your classical cyber sphere at home, digital, But you already understand that a lot of operations are done not in the electronic warfare, but in the cyber electronic warfare over there. That's why these spheres, that is one, what to include in the hybrid actions, what not to include. And the second is when they started. And here, 2014 is the obvious date for us because it is the date of open Russian aggression. According to the United Nations General Assembly statement, what does mean aggression? There are 7 points, and at least 2 of them are clearly what Russia did in Crimea. So you don't need any additional investigations or something. Just the fact of blocking Ukrainian ships, Navy ships in the harbor, not allowing them to go, sending Russian ships and just blocking harbor. It is already a point number 5 from the United Nations resolution about what is mean aggression. So that's for sure. However, the fact that when we speak about the Russian-Ukrainian origin of what it is, it's not 2014. It's not a revolution of dignity. I just yesterday finished the article, which should come today or tomorrow at SIPA, about the 20 years of the Tuzla incident. It was the 2003, exactly this day. The incident started on the 30th of September 2003, when it was the first Russian attempt to annex Ukrainian territory. That was this very tiny Tuzla island. It will take a lot of time for you to find where it is, but it is in the Kerch Strait. It is in the very strategic. And the Azov Sea treaty that we needed to sign after this, that was one of the elements of those hybrid warfare activities against Ukraine. It was one of the lawfare. But the fact is, you can go back to the 17th century and the 1652, when the agreement between then Ukraine and, by the way, not Russia, but Moscow, and that we will go for the Moscovia, because there were no such state in Russia at that time. The agreement that signed the factor and how it was manipulated after, how it was faked after. I mean, for me, that is the textbooks of the hybrid warfare, not speaking about with the later issues. So that's why that is definitely a very huge issue, what to include, and complexity of the events of the last 9 years. We will concentrate on that, not going that deep in the history. Give us more and more questions as scholars to ask what in reality we need to analyze. And the second is where it started. Now I will make several footnotes, let's say, about myself, so it will be, I cannot say easier, maybe even more complicated to accept that information that I will be giving further, but it will give you understanding about bias or non-bias. You talked here about the, including some of the Russian narratives that they sent as the explanations to the war. So I'm ethnic Ukrainian, but I'm Russian speaker. I still speak Russian with my mom and my father. So you cannot make me a crazy Ukrainian nationalist and the protector of something like Russians call us Nazi, yeah, for sure, just because we're for the sovereignty of the country. But the very simple reason, in my city of 1 million people, we're the second biggest city in Ukraine. We have only one Ukrainian school when I graduated high school in 1998. Already being 7 years independent as a state. So that is about Russian speakers, and at the same time I have a lot of friends who are ethnic Russian, who are currently Ukrainian speakers and much more nationalistic than I about Russia. So that is definitely like my word. The second, I'm from Odessa, a big seaport, a city that by the official version was created by the Russian Empire and received the whole glory as the part, it was the third biggest city in the Russian Empire. Half of the Russian classical literature authors or opera singers, they were from Odessa or lived in Odessa, so we were considered part of this. I know Russian literature better than Ukrainian classical literature. I have a library at home bigger than many of Russian schools in Russia. So that's why, and the Russians were sure that Odessa would be the first city to surrender, and it was even a very funny story, because this story is more about these stories to illustrate you, to feel what it is on the ground. When the war just started, Russians started to spread gossips in the social networks that Odessa is waiting for the Russian soldiers that much, that our mayor bought 1 million roses from Ecuador, roses flowers, and the ship with roses are currently in Odessa port, waiting for Russian soldiers to be greeted. But that is example of the hybrid warfare, that's information warfare, because the ship was really in Odessa port with flowers, but the reason, 8th of March, the International Women's Day is the national holiday in Ukraine. So sellers always, like you before the St. Valentine's Day, yeah? It's like to say that all hearts that are bought by the sellers and the shoppers before 14th of February, that is for somebody to come and occupy a battle. The same as these flowers were really there, they just arrived, not ordered by mayor, made to the Mexico, but just by business, for the like to distribute in the shops. But Russia said that we are waiting for them. You see how we are waiting till now, yeah? That is, but that's understanding, I mean, from where am I? My background is in conflict studies. I've been in a lot of conflict zones around the globe. So I always thought that it was easier to analyze conflicts before the war came to my house. And for 5 years before this invasion, I participated in different Russian-Ukrainian dialogues for the second track diplomacy. Closed door, everything. So I really was one of those who believed that conflicts can be solved in diplomatic means. As for now, not that much, I would say. My professors of the peace studies will be a little bit dissatisfied, but for them I always have a trip, a very touristic, to Bucha, Irpin, or to Kherson region, and to show them the torture places or the other places. So that is the situation that where we are. And now let's go to their situation on the ground, from the hybrid to reality. First of all, it seems to me that if we go, I will just leave it. I'm not doing it. This is so different here. So that is, if we go on the ground and where we analyze and how to look at the events, if we go to the series, people like my favorite guy, Merschmeyer. I met him personally, that's why I'm telling like this, in Chicago in 2016. I hope he still remembers. I was kind of a little bit quarrel. He needed second drink after this. Because that's very nice to see him in the Chicago soft chair and look to the events from the theoretical approach, but the problem is that Russian aggression against Ukraine is definitely not within the offensive realism that he's also of. And if you go from the logic, and that's probably why all of us underestimated the threat in winter 2021-2022, because we saw that Russia is logical. We saw from the balance of power, of the capacities, of the number of tanks, we saw what Russia really can gain. And everybody agreed, including my Russian colleagues who were very close to the Kremlin at that time. They said, like, we realized that by threatening of using the force, we can gain much more. The US was almost ready for Ukraine to agree to certain compromises about its future. Entering Ukraine was the biggest mistake for the Russian Federation. They lost, not gained what they wanted, and they lost both strategically, economically, and in terms of the ground idea why they were come. However, at that time, it seems to me the events of winter 2022 and up to now is better to analyze from the point of view of constructivists. Because that is a perfect example how mental map and the past of the person, especially person but also of the country, influence our decision maker. And the second is how we are creating reality around us, how we are constructing a certain reality and paradigms in which we are living. And in this case, why I quote you thought about Merschmeyer, the problem of Merschmeyer, he is analyzing the situation and still looking to Russia as it is the Soviet Union. he is a Sovietologist. He is not a Russian specialist. And that is a big problem. And that's also the problem of some of the authors who look into Ukraine being Russian specialists because they don't know anything about Ukraine. They're looking through the prism of Moscow or Russian literature. But at the same time, for those who are Sovietologists, that is even more difficult. Because they think about military production, they're thinking about great armed forces, forgetting that you can have 1 million soldiers, but if you don't train these soldiers, they're not the same capable. You can have your hundreds of thousands of tanks, but if you forget to put some oil, your tank will not go. Or if you put to your huge tracks Chinese cheap tires because of the corruption that you stole money, your cargo would never be delivered and your logistics would be lost. And that is what's happening in the beginning of the war, for example. So what is on the paper, how you construct it and created your image and what you have, that's really what became a very bad joke with people like Hirschmeyer. And that's why he started to look different things. When you look to the Russian ideologists, Russian philosophers, Russian experts, that's very interesting. They were very open about what it is about. It's never been about NATO enlargement. Russia found for themselves two very nice explanations. Explanation number one is NATO enlarging, or but they say it's expansion. That's again about constructivism. Yeah, how you name the things. It's not enlargement when countries apply and want to be part of something well-developed and modern. That is more. That is expansion. And when you say expansion, you always have this negative feeling about it. And the second was definitely protecting of the people of Donbass. And here I forgot about the third footnote. My family is from Donbass originally. And if you, unfortunately, all my grandfathers died, but my grandpa was a very famous journalist there and historian. If you look to his photos from 1950s, he's in Ukrainian national embroidery. And that was Donbass. My grandma, till now, spoke more Ukrainian than Russian. She spoke a crazy mix. We have such dialect when you mix two languages. But that's what she spoke. The fact that it was artificially made Russian-speaking region after the Second World War, when, first of all, according to the decree of the Soviet Union, all universities around the countries were made to teach only in Russian language. So as soon as you were a person who went to the university, you could become a Russian speaker immediately. The second, because it is the industrial region, and you needed a lot of manpower for the restoration of the region. And what Russians did, they allowed everybody from Russia to come to that territory, especially criminals, because that was a chance for them to receive new documents. So a lot of the ex-criminals came there to work, created very special culture. But they were strong men, ready to work and to have clean biography. Sorry. So, when you return back to the Russian text, you understand that for Russia, that is first of all about being a great, I would not say power, but a great and being an empire. Soviet Union was an empire. Russian Empire was an empire. That's why now, for example, for me, very difficult to speak with some experts in Africa when we're explaining that Ukrainian war is anti-colonial war, and I received the response, you're white, you cannot be a colony. So thank you for your racism, but let's look to the facts. What does it mean to be a colony and what Russia did? That is exact, doesn't mean that we were of the same race. The question, and that is why when we turn to the current events, you clearly see the consequences of these. And for Russia, this feeling of empire is very important because when you are empire, you need a great past. Each empire needs a glorification of something in the past. And that's from where we came to the whole industry of faking Russian history and creating myths around it. And that is an important lesson, and that is the important part of the hybrid warfare. Because that started not in 2014. We analyzed Russian series, like detective stories, then blockbusters, historical movies, and really entertainment industry, comedy shows as well. You will see how they, first of all, deleted part of the history at all. Then they took history of Ukraine, of Belarus, of Caucasus, of some other countries, and made them Russian. You can see it in museums. When you come to the Metropolitan in New York or in British Museum in London, you see Ukrainian painters that never even lived in Russian Empire, but only in the territory of Ukraine. You see Ukrainian motifs even over there, but it is written Russian painter. Why Russian? Just because it was a Russian Empire? United Kingdom is not making all Indian painters as the British painters, just because India was part of the Russian Empire. However, Russia was doing it for literature, for music, for painters, for arts, for ballet. Tchaikovsky, by the way, sorry, and Prokofiev, they have nothing with Russia in this way as well. A little bit of bad news. But then the same is happening with bringing Christianity. Russia always presented themselves at the third row, but they say that Christianity was brought by Kiev, Kiev, capital of Ukraine. And when this Christianity was done by the leader of the Kiev Rus, by the way, that was the name Rus, Moscow even didn't exist as the city. It was nothing of that territory at all. The term Russia appeared only in the 18th century. Peter the Great, in the middle of Northern War, decided that it would be not Moscow state, as it was officially called, not Moscovia if you look to the old pictures, but Russian state. And if you, and usually the names are coming from some geographical stance or something, you cannot find anything with the root Rus around those territories. However, if you go around Kiev, we have the river with the same Ruska. We have several villages with the name of this. So etymology even is not coming from those. This pan-Slavism that very often you hear, this Slavic nation and creation of the certain, again, the language, the very simple example, the names of the monsters. Balkans, all Eastern European countries, Ukraine, Belarus, we have very similar name, how it sounds. Russia has completely different. They're using Latin names for that. And many other words. So it's everything from language to the even DNA, because they had a lot of the graphene blood and everything. So, but this image, what they created from themselves, that, and why I concentrated that much on these examples, because historical narrative became extremely important for the Russians in their hybrid warfare. Where you belong, part of what you were, who ruled you, what did exist. Was it a Ukrainian state or no? Because in their imagination, in many of their, and now they are rewriting history books. Even in the beginning of the war, it was the war of Wikipedia, as we called it. Russians started edited all articles in Wikipedia, and one of the articles was about Kiev Rus. So the official name of the state was Kievan Rus, and considering that it was one of the biggest European states in the 11th century, you can find it in all maps, in all books, it's everywhere. And it's always been called only Kievan Rus. Russians changed it everywhere to ancient Rus, just to delete the word Kiev. So there is no Kiev over there, it's just ancient. And that's come over there. The Nazi, by the way, why Russians are using Nazi? That's very important, because it's again correlation to the certain psychological, mental affiliation that you have. The Second World War for the post-Soviet space is extremely important phenomenon. And that is something when the whole population has been fighting against something. And Nazi as the main enemy. So as soon as you name somebody Nazi, it is this blink Like, you know, I know something, I realize there is something real bad, what is happening with that. However, to name Ukraine Nazi state is really funny, having Jewish president, Muslim Minister of Defense, and the right political parties, not even far right, but in general what you put to the far right, at the last elections received 1%. 1% support. In Germany they received 20%. In Ukraine only 1%. Are you sure we can be Nazi states? That is, not speaking that the biggest joke in the beginning of 2014 in Ukraine was when two old Jews are talking about, like, among each other and say one to another, like, Boysha, I'm afraid to speak Russian language. Why? Ukrainian nationalists will come and kill you? No, Putin will come and protect me. All my Jewish friends were speaking, like, I mean, that started each conversation, like, have you heard this statement? But that is reality. Now turning back to more of the nowadays, Gerasimov doctrine, the fact is plagiat. It's not a doctrine. Because what you wrote inside was just a compilation, it was more reflecting about what is happening around the globe, or what methods others can use against us. And from Gerasimov doctrine, that was the period of starting this feeling of what it is there, I would say how Russia created enemies around. So for Russia in 2022, this war is twofold. One is definitely about Ukraine. It is about this imperialistic suppression, not giving Ukraine a right to sovereignty for existence with a nationhood, but also not allowing Ukraine to be a democratic state. Because for many Russians, if Ukraine succeeds, it means that certain changes should come inside of Russia. And the Putin regime, and it is not, is definitely happening. But the second is looking to others, because each time we are saying to other world that it is not, we are not fighting with Ukrainians. You are the enemy. And that's our problem, how to make others to be with us. And from here, what Ukraine do, and to refer, considering that I need to come to the conclusions, I will respond to some of your issues about the war in which we appeared in 2022, when in this hybrid, all those elements like information, Russians are extremely active in social networks, creating fake accounts of our military brigades to just spreading gossip. Energy and economic blockade. Ukrainian ports, from where 70% of our exports took place, are under the blockade for 19 months. Energy, they are not selling us any gas anymore, so, and they are blackmailing our European friends. That's all happening. Political proxies, finding those inside of the country, and that is a very important element of the hybrid warfare. Your propaganda direct and your direct influence is less influential than if you find somebody inside of the country who share. This person can be not even pro-Russian, but for example just anti-American. But this person will multiply the narratives that are important for your operations. Very classical things. But that came to the year when the conventional war became more important. And here I would absolutely disagree with you that drones are in the weapon of weak. I would say that drones is the weapon of smart. Because by 2020, Russian Federation was not developing drones at all. They had few projects since Soviet time for the reconnaissance drones of very poor quality, so they had them, but that was something, I mean, few, like around. Only after Nagorno-Karabakh war between Azerbaijan and Armenia in 2020, when Azerbaijan won also because of the Turkish Bayraktar drones, Russia suddenly paid attention. At that time, Ukraine already signed agreements with Turkey, and the agreement was not only to buy these combat drones, but also to build a plant for their producing in Ukraine. As for now, our Ministry of Defense had approximately 1,000 different drones used by the armed forces, and approximately the same amount that are under the process of testing. our producers received a carte blanche for the drones and the quick process of checking. But not only classical aerial drones, but Ukraine is using maritime drones. And these drones changing the warfare in the Black Sea significantly. So that is about asymmetric warfare. What you can do if suddenly you lost your navy. Ukrainian drones, some of them has the 450 kilograms of the explosion. So we are not speaking only about these small drones. Some of these, like Marichka, for example, or others, it's huge like torpedo, but it is a drone that can be used both for reconnaissance and attack. Ukraine is the first country that in land war targeted submarine and won. Just 2 weeks ago, Russia lost one of the submarines stationing in the port because of the attack of this time. Kerch Bridge, several ships, including their biggest, but the biggest ship being flagship being by the missile. By the way, Ukrainian Northwestern Navy was the Ukrainian neutral missile. So technology should be considered from this perspective. Current warfare, despite the use of a lot of the classical, we again return to the necessity of tanks. We again to the necessity of airplanes for support. But also those who are thinking ahead. And here, for example, Ukraine is using our IT army very actively, and we are the first who created a unique system called DATA. It is the system that none of the NATO countries even has. They are now studying about its implementation. It's created by the IT specialists, including the artificial intelligence. The fact that that system that gather information from all forces, from all drones, airplanes, radars, reports on the ground, all of these are coming in a single system, and anybody from the commanders can have access to it. So it's not only people on the ground, but also the unique ability to analyze all this big amount of data and act accordingly. And we know that it helps a lot our soldiers on the ground to be more clever than our enemy, to see several steps ahead and to be more creative on the ground. And the last will be probably for this stage for me about the moral. I think that here, like first of all, you are absolutely wrong about how Russian population support or not support war. 80% of Russians support war. That's according to their sociology. And we can confirm it by monitoring their social networks. Like, that is benefit of being Russian speaker. Yeah, you easily can read their social networks. Unfortunately, because Russia created this domestic propaganda previously that much about all these imperialistic moves, about bad Ukrainians and so on, they support this war. But also they support this war because that became a huge source of income. Because Russia couldn't give, like Russia is rich state, but that is rich for oligarchs. As soon as you